Welcome to Rights in Russia's monthly English interview. It's November 26, 2024, and our guest today is Andreas Umland, a political scientist and expert in modern Russian and Ukrainian history and politics. Dr. Umland currently divides his time mostly between Stockholm and Kyiv. He is a research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Relations in Stockholm and teaches at the National University of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He's also a senior scholar at the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. He's written extensively on the development of post-Soviet countries, including studies of the extreme right and nationalism. He speaks with us today from Kyiv. Welcome back to Rights in Russia, Andreas.
Thanks for having me. My new position is now analyst for the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies. I should have told you.
Okay, I will correct that for your next appearance. All
okay.
Right. Let's begin with an update on the war. When we first talked in March 2022, Ukraine was making unexpected gains against Russia, and then in April 2024, the situation was more of a stalemate, with Russia retaking some territory previously held by Ukraine. Now, there are several new variables at play, including the presence of North Korean troops in Russian forces, the U.S. authorization for Ukrainian use of long-range missiles, and the election of Donald J. Trump in the U.S. What, in your view, will be the impact of these various factors and their significance? And maybe we can begin with the North Koreans. Kind of why are they on the front lines, and what impact will this have, do you think?
The North Korean troops are simply symbolizing the problems that Russia has with getting its own people, its own men mobilized for this war. In spite of very high payouts for this service, many of the people seem to understand well that the chance for survival or for coming out from this war without any loss of health or of limbs or whatever is difficult. So these North Korean troops are in a way demonstrating the problems that Russia has, and it's also a sign of weakness, I would say. And I don't think that these troops will change much. At least that is the rhetoric here in Kyiv. I'm speaking now in Kyiv that it's expected that these troops will not make much of a change on the front line because they cannot communicate easily. They are not coming with their own military equipment, and so they can take over certain parts of the task, but they cannot really fight on the front line. So the situation is now very dynamic, I would say, in many ways. Unfortunately, on the front line, so in the last months, Russia has been making gains. On the other hand, the Kursk intervention into Russian territory is still ongoing. It may be now continuing for longer because of this permission from the US, France, and Great Britain to use long-range weaponry on legitimate Russian state territory. And obviously, Russia will be having more problems to recover this this territory that Ukraine has captured, and Ukraine will use its Western weaponry now to the full to keep this territory, which has a large political meaning also in possible future negotiations. And the biggest question mark is now about what the Trump presidency will actually mean for this war. It's difficult to predict how Trump will behave. There are different advisors, different actors around him with very different views of this war. So it will also depend on who has actually how much access to him and how much influence on his policies, how also the Republicans will be able and willing to constrain, let's say, Trump. So there are lots of sort of unknown variables now, and it's actually has become very difficult to say anything concretely. There are also positive developments in Europe. There's more and more consolidation around the idea that the Europeans will have to invest more into their own defense and also in Ukraine's defense. There are several, initiatives ongoing. For instance, now a new trend has been to invest into the Ukrainian arms industry, and countries like Denmark and soon apparently also Sweden, they're simply buying Ukraine-made weaponry instead of bringing their own weaponry to Ukraine, thereby supporting also the military-industrial complex of Ukraine, and also getting a better deal because the production here in Ukraine is cheaper than in Western countries. So this is all going on at the same time. Also in Germany, the situation is unstable. But the people here in Kyiv, they are still want to adjust peace. There's now a higher percentage of people who want a ceasefire, a truce as soon as possible. People are very tired. The winter is coming, or has already arrived. And the big question here in Kyiv and in other cities will be how far the people will be able to live under these conditions in winter. Winter is much more complicated than the summer because of the cold weather and the targeted attacks of Russia on the energy infrastructure.
Exactly. And so if Trump were to exert the kind of pressure that he says he's going to exert and towards peace negotiations, are there acceptable lines that you see that people will accept on Ukrainian side?
Well, it's difficult to say because things are in flux now, and one of the questions would be, of course, if you have a ceasefire, would that then be also in the Kursk region? Yeah, so would then Russia actually agree to a line of delineation, a contact line in the future that would take away a small part of Russian territory? So that's why I think the Ukrainian side is also trying to continue this intervention into Russian state territory, because that will be then, of course, a tricky question. And as I said, it may be now actually possible for Ukraine to hold on to this territory, as they now can use long-range weaponry from the US and from Britain and France in the Kursk region. So so the situation is complicated. I think there will be no official giving away of territory. I mean, there could be some sort of truce, as indeed the Ukrainian population now is tired of the war, and the opinion polls are changing, and then there may be here some consensus emerging on getting a truce and then letting the currently occupied territories be in a sort of interregnum state for a while. But it's difficult to say because the discussions here are very complicated within Ukraine. There's a large part of the population that wants a truce, but there's also a very, very vocal minority. It is now, and also the majority of, I would say, the political intellectual elite that do not see that as a good decision, because it's simply a postponement of a war, and it will be simply a time that will give Russia more time or more opportunity to prepare the next attack. So it's here a difficult decision. It's also, I think, for Moscow a difficult decision, because the four mainland territories that Russia has annexed in 2022 are now parts of the Russian Federation according to the Russian constitution. And Putin, as president, is the so-called guarantor of the constitution. So he is obliged to fulfill the constitution, and that means, in this case, that Russia should fully conquer the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Kursk, and Donetsk oblasts. And for Kherson and Zaporizhia, it does not even control the capitals of these regions, the cities of Kherson and Zaporizhia. And I cannot imagine that Trump would really pressure Ukraine to give away territory that has not been captured by Russia and occupied by Russia. That would be difficult to imagine. And the third factor here is Europe, because the Europeans have their own interests in all of this. And I mean, there is some hope that actually Europe may, as time goes by, get its act together and could mobilize enough resources, enough money to replace the U.S. as the main weapons provider. That is also possible, but we will see. I mean, it's very difficult to predict what will come out of it, and I mean, you would know better what the repercussions in the U.S. would be if Trump would pressure Zelensky into an unjust peace, or even try to pressure him to give up additional territory, to withdraw from the Kursk region or something like that. I guess that would be unpopular in the US, also with the Republican Party. And so I don't know what will come out of all of this. The next months are going to be very dynamic, I suppose.
Thinking about the EU and Ukraine, there had been some talk about integrating Ukraine into the EU. Is this a possibility? There's also some people have talked about having troops, EU troops, along the borders in Ukraine. Are these realistic possibilities?
I think these are two different issues. I think the EU integration and accession is now basically a done deal. The problem here being that these accession procedures usually take several years because the legislation and the state structures have to be adapted by the acceding countries. And that this sort of long process is not just for Ukraine. It's always around 10 years, roughly, between the start of the candidacy and then the eventual accession, the full ratification of all the accession documents and the full membership of the country. So we're talking now here also, I guess, about an accession, I would think, after 2030, maybe not long after 2030, but probably not before 2030. But that this process is happening and will be happening is now basically a done deal. As I said, it's the accession process has started and will now continue more or less quickly for the next years. And at some point, Ukraine will be a member of the European Union. That is now already foreseeable. European troops, EU troops would be the wrong expression, because there are no EU troops. The national states of the EU have troops that they may send to Ukraine. And in fact, there's also a non-EU country involved in these negotiations, Great Britain, which has left the EU. So this is again something back here on the agenda, which has also to do with the fact that these EU countries and Great Britain have their own national interests in that. For instance, the continental, Central and East European countries don't want to get millions and millions of refugees from Ukraine, and that's one of the very national interests that they have in stabilization of Ukraine. And so there are now again talks going on between France and Britain about perhaps sending troops. So far, I think this is mainly political signaling towards Moscow for a scenario that could be realized in the future. I don't think it will soon happen. The fact alone that this is now being discussed is already remarkable and is, of course, very good and is also encouraging for Ukraine. It's a big topic in Ukraine. For now, I think the major support will be in terms of equipment and training and ammunition and also helping to for the energy system, for the civilian infrastructure, that it continues working, especially now in the winter.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the view from Ukraine of NATO, particularly under a Trump presidency? I mean, how is that being discussed?
Well, the Trump presidency is here for, above all, related to this issue in terms of whether Trump's peace plan is, if he will have one, will exclude or postpone NATO membership. I think Ukraine wants into NATO in whatever shape it is, even if sort of Trump formally or informally withdraws the United States from NATO. I think Ukraine would still want to be in NATO. So that is something that is a very high priority here, is seen as the prime solution for Ukraine's security issues. The Istanbul negotiations in 2022 foresaw a postponement of Ukraine's accession to NATO, but the alternative was then foreseen in these negotiations were security guarantees by Western countries that would create de facto something like a mini NATO for Ukraine, where Western countries would take up security guarantees that would be actually more concrete than those that are in the Washington Treaty, in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, and that would actually oblige Western countries to help Ukraine in case of a new escalation. And that was a little bit an odd result of these negotiations, because these were negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, and that was agreed upon in a certain draft of this treaty, and Ukraine was actually happy with this draft treaty in the case that it would have been signed, and indeed Western countries would have taken over very concrete security guarantees of actually sending troops to Ukraine and getting very directly involved in a future possible Russian-Ukrainian escalation if it happens. So that was something that Ukraine could agree to as a substitution for NATO, these sort of concrete security guarantees. But the problem here is, of course, that to my knowledge, no country has actually ever agreed to these security guarantees. That was just something that Ukrainians basically dreamt up and wrote into this draft treaty, and then were also happy about this draft treaty, and thought that they could actually get Western countries to commit to very far-reaching obligations. But this then later on, this draft treaty was undermined anyway by Russia, both in legal terms and in practical terms. Russia then introduced into this draft treaty a clause that would actually give Russia a veto power towards with regard to the fulfillment of these security guarantees, which would have been absurd, of course, if Russia would decide whether Ukraine could get Western help. And also then the things in Bucha happened, the massacres of civilians on occupied territory, and this was then something that became politically totally unfeasible. And one wonders why people are still discussing this Istanbul Treaty, because there were many, or this draft treaty, there were a lot of oddities around it, and it was something that was really a very raw draft that was very far away from being signed and implemented.
Right. So turning now to accountability, you mentioned the massacres in Bucha. It's the war has been going now for over 1,000 days. It has been brutal, and many civilians, infrastructure has been destroyed. There are several efforts afoot to hold Russia accountable under international law. And in the International Criminal Court in 2023 issued arrest warrants for Putin and his commissioner for children's rights, alleging the war crime of unlawful deportation and transfer of children. And then later, more recently in June, the ICC issued further arrest warrants for Russian military officers, 3 of them for directing attacks at civilians and crimes against humanity. And in addition, there are many journalists and human rights advocates that are systematically documenting war crimes to serve as evidence in future trials. What's your view of these official and non-governmental efforts now underway? And to what extent is the Ukrainian public aware and supportive of seeking justice for war crimes?
Here in Ukraine, it's a huge topic, and people want a just peace. They want the return of the prisoners of war, of the deported children, of the deported other civilians, and they also want justice and prosecution and so on. So it's a very big topic here in Ukraine, but unfortunately, I'm afraid this is going to take time. The ideal implementation of this prosecution and these court trials and so on would be, of course, one in Russia by Russian courts and by Russian prosecutors and so on. Maybe there will be one day a situation like that. But for now, I think the best what can do is to use the international courts and for civil society is to collect the data and prepare future trials and to then be ready when a different period comes, when perhaps Russia as a state either transforms fundamentally or collapses. This is something that is being more and more talked about, that there could be a collapse of the current Russian Federation, and then many things would change, and then perhaps all this accumulated information will come in handily, and then one could perhaps capture some of these criminals and then prosecute them. But for now, I think this is something that will have to wait for major changes happening in Russia.
Mm-hmm. If we were to go back to 2022, do you think anything could have been done to prevent or mitigate the destruction that has followed?
Well, we just talked already about the Istanbul negotiations, and I don't think they were really they ever had a chance to lead to anything, because they would have involved actually basically Western countries committing to entering World War III in defense of Ukraine. And, national governments would have to agree to be ready to enter a war with the largest nuclear power. Russia has the most nuclear warheads in the world, has more than the US even. And I don't think this would have ever happened, actually. This was something that the Ukrainians sort of wanted, of course, from Western countries, but they wouldn't have gotten that. Mm-hmm. Then when Russia then introduced this clause about its veto right on security guarantees, then this whole thing became ridiculous. So the only other, I think, option that there should have been much quicker weapons deliveries, both before the start of the full-scale invasion on 24th of February 2022 and and immediately afterwards. So if these weapons that have then later on been delivered after long discussions by Western countries had arrived already in 2022, it could have been all over, because Ukraine, even with its largely Soviet weaponry or post-Soviet weaponry, was able to conduct a large counteroffensive in summer and in autumn 2022 and recapture almost half of the territory that Russia had captured in the first couple of months of the war, of the large-scale invasion, full-scale invasion. So if Ukraine had then been already in a position to use HIMARS and ATACMS and so on, then this would have been a totally different game, and perhaps Ukraine would have simply kicked out all of the Russian troops, and then and perhaps even recaptured the territories occupied in 2014, and then it would have been all over already.
So yes, for my last question, it's that now there's just a little more than a month left before a new administration takes over in Washington. So in these next few weeks, how do you think the war will proceed?
I'm afraid it will proceed better for Russia than for Ukraine. And currently what we're seeing is that Russia is capturing basically every day a little bit of territory. It's not that much. Ukraine is a large country. And if you look at the map for 2024 of the whole of Ukraine, it's actually a minor change of the front line. But it is a change to Russia's advantage. I don't expect that to change soon. The major question on the front line will be, for me, whether Ukraine can hold on to at least a small piece of Russian territory in the Kursk region. And as I said, it looks now slightly better with this permission to use long-range weaponry in Russia. But that is going to be the for me now crucial question. Yes, so and then we will have to see what happens in late January when Trump comes into office, and apparently will try to resolve the whole issue. And there are also people here in Ukraine who are hopeful, actually, and who think that maybe somebody like Trump could be very useful for this situation. Especially if he sees that Russia will then perhaps not follow his peace plan and will then sort of boycott his attempts to bring some end to this. So I think Trump will be here in a difficult situation, because he will get pressure from at home. I expect from even from his own party, from the Republicans, to get some deal that is at least partially acceptable for the Ukrainian side. So not a capitulation from Ukraine, but Putin will want to have a capitulation from Ukraine. And then he will have to decide what he will do with this situation, whether he will give Putin what he wants, or whether he will actually then pressure Putin. And so that is going to be an interesting moment.
It will indeed. Well, thank you, Andreas Umland, for this thoughtful and candid conversation during this time of great uncertainty. Best wishes and many thanks.